On the 29th day of August in 1944, somewhere along a muddy intersection of roads not far from Châlons-en-Champagne in the northeastern reaches of France, a German colonel named Friedrich Müller found his hands shaking uncontrollably as he brought down the field glasses from his eyes. What stretched before him across the morning landscape defied everything he had been trained to understand about military operations and the limits of logistics. From one edge of the visible horizon, clear across to the other, ran an unbroken procession of American trucks, every single vehicle loaded down with jerry cans filled with gasoline, their engines creating a synchronized roar that seemed to shake the very earth beneath his concealed position. He twisted around to face his adjutant, a captain by the name of Wilhelm Krause, and what came out of his mouth would ripple through every Wehrmacht command post scattered across the crumbling Western Front. "My God," he said, "no military force on earth possesses the capability to halt that. We are not engaging with soldiers in any traditional sense. What we face is a machine, pure and simple." As the mist of morning continued to hang in the air, Müller had just laid eyes upon something that ran counter to every principle that German military instruction had held sacred regarding supply operations and the conduct of warfare. This was not what anyone would recognize as a conventional supply column. What he witnessed was more accurately described as a river composed entirely of fuel, an unending torrent of petroleum products flowing in an eastward direction at velocities that made no sense according to established military logic. Each individual truck transported 750 gallons of gasoline contained within 150-gallon jerry cans. They passed by his hidden observation position at intervals of 30 seconds, maintaining this pace 24 hours every day, without any pause whatsoever, without rest periods, without any conceivable endpoint. Within the Wehrmacht's operational framework, such a fuel convoy supporting even a single division would have been celebrated as a logistical achievement of the highest order. Yet what Müller observed represented merely one single artery within the vast circulatory system known as the Red Ball Express, feeding George Patton's Third Army as it tore across France at speeds that left German commanders frozen in a state of disbelief. The mathematical calculations of what Müller witnessed that morning would soon make their way through German intelligence channels, spreading a sense of hopelessness more rapidly than Patton's tanks could advance. The Third Army by itself was consuming 800,000 gallons of gasoline with each passing day. This singular army was using more fuel in a 24-hour period than the entire German Army Group B had been allocated throughout the previous month. The strategic implications were absolutely catastrophic for the Wehrmacht. If the Americans possessed the capability to sustain such rates of consumption, if they could transport such quantities without any interruption whatsoever, then every single calculation that the Wehrmacht had formulated about defensive positions, about the traditional strategy of trading territory for time, about degrading Allied momentum through the natural extension of supply lines, was fundamentally and completely incorrect. This revelation had actually commenced 5 days prior, on the 24th of August in 1944, when a colonel named Christian von Gersdorff, serving as Chief of Staff for the German 7th Army, received his initial intelligence reports concerning a massive American trucking operation that appeared to have materialized seemingly out of thin air overnight. The Americans had made the decision to designate 2 parallel highway routes running from Cherbourg all the way to Chartres, a total distance covering 200 miles, for the exclusive use of military convoys. There was to be no civilian traffic whatsoever. No military vehicles were permitted unless they bore the distinctive red ball markings. Nothing else was allowed except for this endless stream of trucks transporting supplies to the rapidly advancing American armies. The northern route handled loaded vehicles heading toward the east, while the southern route accommodated empty trucks returning westward. The simplicity of this arrangement seemed to mock the complex German staff planning that had invested years in developing intricate railway timetables and horse-drawn supply systems. Von Gersdorff's initial response upon reading these reports was one of complete disbelief. He had completed tours of duty on the Eastern Front, had witnessed the vast expanses of Russian territory, had seen those enormous spaces swallow entire army groups whole, had personally witnessed the Wehrmacht's sophisticated supply apparatus collapse under the weight of the Soviet winter. He understood intimately the iron law of logistics that every military academy drilled into its students. An army possessed the capability to advance only as far and only as rapidly as its supply lines would permit. The Americans were in clear violation of this fundamental law. Patton's spearhead elements were positioned 400 miles distant from the Normandy beaches, yet somehow they continued to receive fuel, ammunition, food supplies and spare parts in quantities that suggested they maintained proximity to a major supply depot. What neither von Gersdorff nor any other German commander initially grasped was that they were bearing witness to the world's first completely motorized supply system operating at its maximum possible capacity. The Red Ball Express represented far more than merely a convoy system in the traditional understanding. It was a physical manifestation of American industrial power being projected directly onto the battlefield itself. Within 72 hours of its initial inception, 132 truck companies had become operational, transporting between 12,000 and 15,500 tons of supplies with each passing day. By way of comparison, the entire German rail network operating throughout France at its peak efficiency levels had never succeeded in moving more than 8,000 tons per day to frontline units. A general lieutenant named Otto Elfelt, who had commanded the 84th Army Corps before being captured in the vicinity of Brest, later provided detailed testimony regarding his observations of American logistics operations. During his transport to prisoner camps, Elfelt made a point of counting the vehicles his convoy passed. In a span of just 20 minutes of travel, he observed a greater number of operational trucks than his entire corps had possessed at the commencement of the Normandy campaign. Every single vehicle appeared to be in perfect mechanical condition. Every driver had access to a relief operator. Every truck carried additional fuel for its own consumption beyond its cargo. The wastefulness was magnificent in its scope. Trucks ran their engines while sitting stationary. Drivers discarded half-consumed rations. Maintenance crews replaced tires that showed only minor wear patterns. During interrogation sessions conducted by an intelligence officer who spoke German without any trace of accent, Elfelt made a comment that would be permanently recorded in Allied after-action reports. "Your supply system," he explained to his captors, "operates like a factory assembly line, except functioning in reverse. Instead of bringing component parts together to construct machines, you bring fuel forward to move machines. We cannot possibly compete with this approach. We continue to fight the previous war while you are fighting the war that comes next." The German officer proved to be more correct in this assessment than he could have known. The Red Ball Express operated according to principles that had been developed in the manufacturing facilities of Detroit. The system had been designed with a singular purpose in mind, to maintain the forward momentum of Patton's advance, to keep his tanks rolling eastward at speeds faster than German units could establish defensive positions. A major named Hans Rötiger, serving as a staff officer with Panzer Brigade 106, witnessed the full scope of American logistics firsthand on the 2nd day of September when his unit made an attempt to establish a blocking position in the area near Verdun. He had received assurances from Army Group headquarters that the Americans had outrun their supply capabilities, that Patton's advance absolutely must pause to allow logistics operations to catch up with combat units. This represented standard German doctrine, knowledge gained through 4 years of continuous warfare. Rapid advances created salients that transformed into traps when supply lines were severed. The Africa Corps had absorbed this lesson in the desert campaigns. The Sixth Army had perished learning it at Stalingrad. But as Rötiger positioned his 8 operational Panther tanks on elevated ground overlooking the Meuse River Valley, he witnessed something that completely shattered these doctrinal assumptions. The road visible below his position was absolutely solid with American vehicles, not combat units pushing forward, but supply trucks, hundreds upon hundreds of them, flowing eastward without any pause whatsoever. Through the magnification of his binoculars, he could make out the nomenclature stamped on the vehicles. GMC CCKW, the legendary Deuce and a Half, each one possessing the capability to transport 2.5 tons of cargo across any type of terrain imaginable. These were not the requisitioned civilian vehicles that the Wehrmacht had come to rely upon, constantly experiencing mechanical breakdowns, requiring specialized component parts that were often impossible to obtain. These were purpose-built military trucks, standardized in their construction with completely interchangeable parts, maintained by mechanics who had received training on identical vehicles. The mathematics of what Rütiger observed through his field glasses were absolutely staggering in their implications. In the space of 1 hour, he counted 240 trucks passing his observation position. That represented 600 tons of supplies being delivered in 60 minutes to units that were supposedly isolated and vulnerable to counterattack. His 8 Panther tanks carried sufficient ammunition for perhaps 20 minutes of sustained combat engagement. The Americans moving along the road below him were transporting enough supplies to sustain an entire division for a week of operations. He made the decision to withdraw his unit without firing a single shot, radioing back to headquarters that the position was fundamentally untenable. In his personal war diary, which was discovered after his capture in March of 1945, he had written that they were not facing an army in any conventional sense, but rather a conveyor belt of military power. The Americans do not supply their forces in the traditional manner, he wrote. They manufacture victory through the application of logistics. The most devastating German testimony emerged from an unexpected source, a general of paratrooper forces named Hermann Ramke, who commanded the 2nd Paratrooper Division and had fought in Crete, throughout North Africa and in Russia before finding himself in the position of defending Brest against American forces. Before the siege operations commenced, his reconnaissance units managed to capture an American supply convoy that had taken an incorrect turn near Rennes. The 20 trucks they seized contained more supplies than his entire division had received throughout the previous 2 months of operations. 10,000 gallons of gasoline, 500 cases of sea rations, 100,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, spare parts for vehicle types his men had never even seen before, chocolate bars, cigarettes, instant coffee, and postal mail from home that bore dates less than 2 weeks old. But what truly shocked Ramke were the drivers themselves. They were African-American soldiers serving with the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company, an integral part of the Red Ball Express operation. Under interrogation procedures, they revealed details that Ramke initially refused to accept as credible. They explained that they drove for 10-hour shifts, at which point they were relieved by fresh drivers who took the same truck forward for another 10 hours of operation. The vehicles themselves never stopped moving except for refueling and scheduled maintenance procedures. Each driver had undergone 3 months of specialized training specifically for this operation. They possessed driver's manuals, maintenance schedules, standardized procedures covering every possible contingency. When Ramke inquired about horses, which were essential to German logistics operations, the captured sergeant actually laughed and explained that they had only observed horses being used to pull German equipment. The racial dynamics of what he observed revealed another dimension of American power that German ideology possessed no framework to process correctly. National Socialist doctrine proclaimed American society inherently weak precisely because of its racial diversity. Yet standing before him were black soldiers, supposedly inferior according to German racial theory, operating complex machinery with a level of skill that exceeded anything Ramke had witnessed within the Wehrmacht. They spoke of technical training schools, of mechanical aptitude testing programs, of specialized courses in convoy operations. The German military, which took immense pride in its racial purity and martial superiority, was being outdriven and outsupplied by Americans it had dismissed as mongrels and degenerates. A general of panzer troops named Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, provided what was perhaps the most comprehensive German assessment of American logistics capabilities. Captured on the 31st of August near Amiens, He spent several days being transported between various American headquarters for interrogation purposes. During these journeys, he had the opportunity to observe the full scope of the Allied supply system in operation. In a post-war memoir that he wrote in 1953, he recalled his growing amazement at what appeared to be infinite resources flowing toward the front lines. Every bridge that had been destroyed had been rebuilt stronger than it was before, Eberbach wrote in his account. Every road had been widened and reinforced with proper engineering. Engineers followed so closely behind the combat units that sometimes they were captured while still working in the front lines. They constructed supply dumps at intervals of every 20 miles, with each one being larger than our biggest depots located in Germany itself. They laid pipelines specifically for fuel transport, following the advance like veins carrying blood through a body. I observed more vehicles in one single day of captivity than I had commanded throughout my entire military career. Eberbach found himself particularly struck by the American approach to equipment losses and replacement. When he mentioned that his Panzer Group had been reduced to a total of 17 operational tanks, his interrogator casually mentioned that the Third Army had received 400 replacement Sherman tanks in the previous week alone. When Eberbach expressed his disbelief at this figure, he was shown actual supply manifests as evidence. Tank engines airlifted directly from Detroit, complete artillery pieces shipped from arsenals that had not even existed when the war began, radios being manufactured at a rate of 1,000 units per day. The Americans did not repair equipment in the field, they simply replaced it wholesale. They did not conserve resources, they consumed them freely. They did not husband their materials carefully. They overwhelmed opposition through sheer abundance. The systematic collection of German officer observations by American intelligence units revealed a clear pattern of psychological collapse in the face of such overwhelming logistical superiority. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Allen, serving as intelligence officer with Patton's Third Army, compiled these reactions into a report that would go on to influence American military doctrine for decades to come. German officers consistently expressed variations on the same fundamental theme. They had prepared themselves for tactical battle, but instead encountered industrial warfare on a scale they had never imagined. They had trained to fight soldiers, but found themselves facing an assembly line of military production. They had studied Napoleon and Clausewitz, but confronted the principles of Henry Ford and Alfred Sloan instead. A general major named Johannes von Luttwitz, commander of the 2nd Panzer Division, captured near Bastogne in December of 1944, provided a retrospective analysis that captured the German officer corps' complete misunderstanding of American capabilities and methods. "We calculated based on our experience fighting the Soviet Union," he explained to his interrogators. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets possessed numbers but maintained primitive logistics systems. They relied heavily on American trucks and canned meat products. We assumed the Americans, fighting so far from their homeland, would be even more constrained by distance and supply difficulties. We did not realize they had brought America itself with them across the ocean. Every soldier functioned as a small factory of destruction, supplied in a manner unlike any army in human history. Von Luttwitz went on to describe watching American infantry units engaged in combat operations, noting details that illustrated the depth of their supply system. He observed individual soldiers discarding ammunition that German troops would have carefully conserved. He watched medics using supplies in quantities that would have sustained a German field hospital for weeks. He witnessed communications equipment so abundant that every squad possessed radio capabilities that in the Wehrmacht would have been available only at battalion level or higher. During interrogation sessions, von Luttwitz was permitted to tour an American supply depot, an experience that he later described as more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. The depot covered 40 acres of ground and contained supplies that had been categorized with scientific precision. Every item was catalogued, indexed and cross-referenced in a comprehensive system. Requisitions were processed in hours rather than weeks. Stock levels were maintained automatically, with reorders being triggered by consumption rates that had been calculated using IBM machines and statistical methods. This was not military supply, as we had come to understand it over centuries of European warfare, a general named Walter Warlimont testified after the war. This was scientific management principles applied directly to warfare. They had reduced logistics to pure mathematics, to formulas that could be calculated and executed with precision regardless of circumstances. We still relied on staff officers with extensive experience and intuition developed over years of service. They relied on systems that functioned effectively regardless of which personnel operated them. Any American sergeant could operate their supply system more efficiently than our best-trained quartermasters with decades of experience. The German officers' education in American logistics continued throughout the fall of 1944, as Patton's Third Army maintained its relentless forward advance despite supply lines that by this point stretched over 500 miles in length. Wehrmacht doctrine insisted categorically that this was an impossibility. German staff colleges taught as fundamental truth that 300 miles represented the absolute maximum distance for motorized supply operations, and that assumed perfect weather conditions and no enemy interference whatsoever. Yet the Americans were sustaining combat operations at distances that should have caused complete logistical collapse according to every principle of military science. A colonel with the title of Graf von Schwerin, serving as Chief of Staff for the 116th Panzer Division, documented his observations during the division's fighting retreat through Belgium in September. His unit had been reduced to siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles wherever they could find them, while American columns passed on parallel roads with trucks carrying nothing but gasoline. German ammunition had been rationed to 10 rounds per day for each artillery piece. Americans conducted preparatory bombardments that lasted for hours without pause. German wounded personnel waited days for evacuation to medical facilities. Americans flew casualties to hospitals located in England within hours of them being wounded. The inequality was not just material in nature, von Schwerin wrote in a letter to his wife that was captured when he was taken prisoner. It was organizational, philosophical, almost spiritual in its dimensions. We fought with a scarcity mindset, conserving every single round of ammunition, every last liter of fuel. They fought with an abundance mentality, knowing with complete confidence that whatever they consumed today would be replaced tomorrow without question. This changes absolutely everything about how one conducts warfare. We attacked objectives in order to capture their supplies. They attacked because they possessed supplies in unlimited quantities. The most revealing German observation came from a source that surprised Allied intelligence officers. A captain named Klaus Friedrich, serving as a supply officer with the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, was captured in October of 1944 after his unit completely ran out of fuel near Metz. During his interrogation sessions, he provided a professional assessment of American logistics that his interrogators considered so insightful that it was forwarded all the way up to Eisenhower's headquarters for review. "You have solved the fundamental problem that has plagued modern warfare since mechanization began," Friedrich told his captors with what seemed like genuine admiration. Not tactics in the traditional sense, not strategy in the classical meaning, but rather the continuous supply of mechanized forces operating at the absolute limits of their advance. Your Red Ball Express is not a supply line in any conventional understanding. It is a weapon system in its own right. Every truck driver functions effectively as a combat multiplier, enabling 10 men at the front to fight continuously without pause. We Germans have perfected the art of warfare as it has been practiced for centuries. You Americans have industrialized it completely. Friedrich continued by describing the cascading effects of American logistics superiority throughout all aspects of military operations. German units were forced to spend 60% of their available time foraging for supplies, requisitioning materials from civilian populations, cannibalizing damaged equipment for spare parts. American units spent that same time training, maintaining their equipment properly, or allowing their men to rest and recover. German officers devoted the majority of their planning efforts to managing scarcity and allocating insufficient resources. American officers could focus their attention on tactical execution and battlefield maneuver. German soldiers fought while hungry, cold, and anxious about ammunition supplies. American soldiers fought well-fed, warm, and confident in the reliability of their supply chain. The psychological impact of encountering American logistics extended far beyond senior officers to affect every level of the Wehrmacht's organizational structure. A private first class named Johann Werkmann, serving as a truck driver with the 9th Panzer Division, described in his personal diary the demoralizing effect of encountering American logistics operations. His unit's vehicles broke down constantly, requiring improvised repairs using salvaged parts scavenged from wrecked equipment. They operated on synthetic fuel that damaged engines and reduced overall performance significantly. Their trucks represented a mixture of German, French, Czech, and Italian manufacture, each type requiring different spare parts, different specialized tools, different maintenance procedures entirely. Then we encountered the Americans in their operations, Werkmann wrote in his diary. Every truck was identical in construction. Every driver possessed the same standardized manual. Every mechanic worked with the same tools and followed the same procedures. They changed tires in 5 minutes flat. We spent hours attempting to patch inner tubes. They possessed special wrenches designed for every bolt and fastener. We made do with pliers and hammers and improvisation. They received new engines delivered by airlift operations. We pushed dead vehicles off the road and continued on foot. The Red Ball Express achieved its peak efficiency in early September of 1944, when it succeeded in delivering 12,142 tons of supplies in a single day of operations. This seemingly dry statistical figure represented more tonnage than most German divisions consumed in a month of combat operations. It meant that Patton's Third Army could maintain continuous offensive operations without pause, never stopping to consolidate gains, never allowing German forces the time necessary to organize coherent defensive positions. The traditional operational pause that had characterized warfare since ancient times, that moment when advancing armies stopped to rest and resupply before continuing, had been eliminated entirely through the application of industrial logistics principles. A general of infantry named Günther Blumentritt, serving as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, later wrote what stands as the most comprehensive German analysis of American logistics in his post-war memoirs. He identified 3 revolutionary aspects that German military thinking had completely failed to anticipate or prepare for adequately. First, the Americans had completely motorized not just their combat units, but their entire supply chain from port to front line, eliminating the speed differential between horse-drawn and motorized elements that had plagued Wehrmacht operations throughout the war. Second, they had standardized equipment to a degree that made mass production and field maintenance possible on a battlefield scale that defied previous understanding. Third, and perhaps most importantly in strategic terms, they had created redundancy at every single level of operations, from spare trucks to duplicate supply routes to excess capacity that could absorb significant losses without any failure of the overall system. We Germans prided ourselves on our efficiency, Blumentritt wrote in his analysis, on our ability to accomplish more with less, on the triumph of will over material constraints. The Americans demonstrated conclusively that in modern industrial war, material resources multiplied by organizational capability equals victory. They did not attempt to do more with less in the German fashion. They did everything with more resources than seemed imaginable. More trucks than we had horses available, more fuel than we possessed ammunition, more spare parts than we had functioning weapons. We approached war as artists creating masterpieces. They approached it as engineers of victory on an industrial scale. The German High Command's growing awareness of American logistical superiority began to influence operational decisions throughout the fall of 1944. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, submitted repeated requests for permission to withdraw his forces to shorter defensive lines that could be supplied more easily, given the deteriorating logistics situation. The Führer refused these requests categorically, insisting that every metre of ground must be held regardless of cost. Model's response, recorded in the official war diary of Army Group B, proved prophetic in its assessment. "The Führer demands we hold ground at all costs," Model observed. "The Americans have made ground itself irrelevant to the outcome. They can supply their forces anywhere with equal effectiveness, making every position equally vulnerable to their attacks. We are fighting the previous war's type of battle against the next war's approach to logistics. This fundamental misunderstanding of how modern mechanized warfare functioned would contribute directly to the catastrophic failure of the German Ardennes offensive in December of 1944. The operational plan assumed that American forces could be separated from their supply lines through rapid maneuver, that captured fuel depots would be able to sustain German advances deeper into Allied territory, that the Red Ball Express supply system could be interdicted by Wehrmacht units breaking through to the coast and cutting supply routes. Every single one of these assumptions proved completely false in practice. American logistics units simply rerouted their convoys around threatened areas, established brand new supply dumps within hours of identifying the need, and continued delivering fuel and ammunition at rates that sustained defensive operations even during the absolute height of the German attack. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, whose battle group spearheaded the SS Panzer assault into American lines, later testified extensively about his growing realization that the offensive was fundamentally doomed when he observed American supply resilience under pressure. His unit had been explicitly promised that captured American fuel depots would sustain their advance once they broke through the initial defensive lines. Instead, what they discovered were depots that had been destroyed using thermite grenades, fuel that had been contaminated with sugar to make it unusable, and supply troops who had evacuated everything of value hours before German forces arrived at the locations. Meanwhile, American units that, according to German calculations, should have been completely cut off and desperate for supplies continued to receive everything they needed through airlift operations, through rerouted convoy movements, through methods and procedures that demonstrated a redundancy and flexibility that German planning had never imagined possible. The education that German officers received in the realities of American logistics extended beyond immediate military implications to broader insights about industrial democracy and the nature of modern warfare in the 20th century. General Colonel Heinz Guderian, the brilliant architect of Blitzkrieg doctrine, and by late 1944, serving as chief of the German General Staff, received regular reports from the Western Front that fundamentally challenged his revolutionary theories of mechanized warfare. Guderian had completely revolutionized military thinking by demonstrating how concentrated armor formations could achieve decisive breakthroughs that shattered enemy defensive lines. But the Americans had revolutionized his revolution in turn, showing that mechanized forces without equally mechanized logistics were ultimately just as limited as the horse-drawn armies they had replaced. In a staff conference held in November of 1944, recorded for posterity by his aide Major Bernd Freytag von Loringhoven, Guderian admitted what no German general had previously been willing to acknowledge openly. "We developed the tactics of mechanized warfare," Guderian stated, "but the Americans have developed its logistics to match. Tactics without corresponding logistics is like a bullet without a gun to fire it from." Impressive in theoretical concept, completely useless in practical application. Every Panther tank we manage to produce requires a supply chain we cannot possibly maintain under current conditions. Every Sherman tank they produce arrives with the trucks necessary to fuel it, the spare parts required to repair it, and the infrastructure needed to sustain it indefinitely in combat operations. The Red Ball Express continued its operations until November 16, 1944, when the opening of the port of Antwerp and the restoration of French railway networks reduced the critical need for emergency trucking operations on such a massive scale. In its 83 days of continuous operation, it had succeeded in delivering over 412,000 tons of supplies, sustained the fastest military advance in modern history, and demonstrated a model of logistics operations that would influence military thinking for generations to come. But perhaps its greatest achievement was psychological in nature. It demonstrated to German professional officers that their entire conception of military operations had become obsolete. A colonel named Hans von Luck, commander of the 21st Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion and one of the Wehrmacht's most respected tactical leaders, provided perhaps the most eloquent summary of German officers' encounter with American logistics capabilities. Captured in April of 1945 after his unit ran out of fuel for the final time, von Luck told his interrogators something that encapsulated the entire German experience. We came to understand that we were not fighting the American army in any traditional military sense. We were fighting the American nation itself projected onto the battlefield. Your tanks were not weapons in the classical understanding, but rather products, manufactured like automobiles and delivered to the front like postal mail. Your soldiers were not warriors in the romantic sense, but workers, efficiently operating the machinery of war. Your generals were not strategists in the Napoleonic tradition, but managers, organizing victory like a business enterprise. You did not defeat us in battle through superior tactics. You processed us through a production line of destruction. The testimonies of German officers regarding American logistics revealed a profound truth about modern warfare that military theorists would spend decades analyzing and attempting to understand fully. The Red Ball Express and the comprehensive system it represented marked the full maturation of industrialized warfare, where ultimate victory belonged not to the side with the best-trained soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but rather to the nation that could most effectively project its industrial capacity directly onto the battlefield. The German Wehrmacht, despite all its tactical excellence and operational innovations that had shocked the world, was fighting what amounted to a pre-industrial war in an industrial age. A general lieutenant named Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division and Rommel's former chief of staff during the Africa campaigns, offered a comparison that resonated deeply through the German officer corps. In Africa, we were defeated by British persistence and American supplies, he observed. In Russia, we were defeated by the winter and Soviet manpower. In France, we were defeated by trucks and American organizational ability. Of these three defeats, the trucks were the most humiliating to our professional pride, because they showed us that everything we believed about the nature of warfare was fundamentally wrong. The statistical evidence supports these German observations with overwhelming clarity that cannot be disputed. During the period when Red Ball Express operations were at their height, Allied forces in France grew from 1.5 million personnel to over 3 million men, with each individual supplied at levels that exceeded peacetime garrison standards in most armies. The Third Army alone consumed more fuel during September of 1944 than the entire German Army Group Center had used during the opening month of Operation Barbarossa. American forces expended artillery ammunition at rates that German gunners could not have achieved even when ammunition supplies were unlimited. Every American division possessed more trucks than an entire German Panzer Corps, more radio equipment than a complete German army, more medical supplies than German civilian hospitals serving major cities. But beyond the raw numbers lay a more fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare itself. The American logistics system operated according to principles of industrial management that German military culture, deeply rooted in Prussian military tradition and twisted by ideology from Berlin, could neither fully understand nor hope to replicate successfully. Initiative was pushed down to the lowest organizational levels, with sergeant truck drivers authorized to make routing decisions that in the Wehrmacht's rigid hierarchy would have required officer approval at minimum. Efficiency was measured not by minimizing waste in the traditional Prussian manner, but by maximizing delivery rates and throughput. Problems were solved through the application of material abundance rather than individual heroism or clever improvisation. A major named Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, serving as a supply officer with the 12th SS Panzer Division, documented this fundamental cultural clash in a report that survived in British archives after the war. We Germans approached warfare as an art to be mastered through individual genius and strength of will, von Thoma wrote. The Americans approached it as an engineering problem to be solved through the application of resources and organizational systems. We sought the decisive battle that would determine the campaign. They sought to apply continuous pressure that would grind down resistance. We measured victory by the amount of ground gained in attacks. They measured it by the tonnage of supplies delivered to maintain operations. We were playing chess and seeking the brilliant combination. They were running a factory and optimizing production output. The impact of witnessing American logistics in action extended even to German enlisted men who directly encountered the Red Ball Express on the battlefield. A sergeant named Heinrich Böll, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning author, but was then simply a Wehrmacht infantry soldier, described in vivid detail his unit's complete demoralization when they successfully ambushed what they believed was a vital American supply convoy, only to discover afterward that it was considered so routine that it travelled without any armed escort whatsoever. The 30 trucks they managed to destroy represented less than an hour's worth of traffic on the Red Ball highway network. The supplies they captured, which would have been sufficient to sustain a German regiment for an entire month of operations, were replaced by American logistics within a matter of days. We realized at that moment, Böll wrote in his post-war memoirs, that we were not adversaries engaged in a fair contest, but rather anachronisms facing the future. We belonged to the age of Napoleon, perhaps to the era of Moltke at the latest. They belonged to the age of Ford and Edison and industrial mass production. Our victories were tactical episodes without strategic significance. Their logistics represented strategic reality that could not be overcome. The German officer corps' encounter with American logistics had immediate tactical implications that shaped the final months of the war across the Western European theatre of operations. Wehrmacht commanders, finally understanding that they could not possibly match American supply capabilities through any means available to them, increasingly adopted a defensive strategy based on fortified cities and river-line obstacles, hoping desperately to force the Americans into positional warfare where logistics advantages would be minimized by static conditions. This strategy failed comprehensively because American engineers rebuilt destroyed bridges faster than German demolition teams could destroy them, because American artillery could maintain sustained bombardments for longer periods than German garrisons could possibly endure them, and because American air supply capabilities could sustain supposedly encircled units that German doctrine insisted absolutely must surrender due to lack of supplies. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who assumed overall command in the West during March of 1945 as the Reich collapsed, conducted a final assessment of German failure that prominently featured American logistics as a decisive factor. In his post-war interrogation sessions, he stated for the record that military history will record that the German army was defeated by the combination of the Russian winter, the British Navy's blockade, and the American truck. Of these three factors, the truck was the most decisive in determining the final outcome, because it represented not just a single weapon system, but an entire approach to warfare, not just supply in the traditional sense, but a form of supremacy, not just logistics as a supporting function, but the fundamental logic of industrial democracy defeating ideological dictatorship through superior organization. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff during the early war years and post-war advisor to the United States Army Historical Division, provided what may stand as the most comprehensive German assessment of American logistics in his contribution to the official history of the Second World War. The Red Ball Express, he wrote with the perspective of years of reflection, was not merely a supply operation in the traditional military understanding. It was a demonstration that in modern industrial war, the factory had become more strategically important than the fortress, the assembly line more decisive in determining outcomes than the battle line, the truck driver as essential to victory as the tank driver. The Americans did not defeat us through superior strategy or superior tactics in the classical military sense. They defeated us by proving conclusively that war had become a branch of industrial management, and that the nation with superior industrial organization would prevail regardless of tactical skill. The German encounter with American logistics crystallized most dramatically in their direct observation of the Red Ball Express and Patton's endless fuel convoys, represented far more than simple military defeat on the battlefield. It was fundamentally a collision between two entirely different worldviews, two completely different systems of social organization, two opposing concepts of national power and how it should be projected. The Wehrmacht, despite all its tactical and operational innovations in mechanized warfare that had revolutionized military thinking, remained at its core a traditional military force, dependent on railway networks, horse-drawn transport, and the kind of improvisational genius that had characterized European warfare for centuries of conflict. The American military, despite its initial tactical inexperience and occasional operational errors that German professionals mocked, represented something entirely new in human history. Industrial democracy weaponized and projected across an ocean, mass production principles militarized for destruction, and logistics elevated from a mere supporting function to the decisive capability that determined victory or defeat. Statistical analysis performed after the war confirms in precise detail the German officers' observations and assessments. During the Red Ball Express's period of operation from August 25th to November 16th of 1944, American trucks drove over 1.5 million miles in total, delivered 412,193 tons of supplies to advancing forces, and maintained a delivery rate that exceeded the combined logistics capacity of all German forces operating in Western Europe. At its absolute peak of efficiency, the Express operated 5,958 vehicles on a dedicated highway system that German forces possessed neither the capability to interdict effectively nor any hope of replicating for their own use. The operation consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just for the purpose of moving fuel forward to combat units, a seemingly circular consumption pattern that German logistics officers considered impossible to sustain for any extended period. The human dimension of the Red Ball Express provided yet another profound lesson for German observers attempting to understand American capabilities. 3/4 of the drivers were African-American soldiers, segregated within the American military system, but absolutely essential to its combat operations. German racial ideology could not reconcile this fundamental contradiction, an allegedly inferior race operating the most sophisticated logistics system in all of military history with remarkable efficiency. The regime's propaganda had portrayed American racial diversity as a critical weakness that would cause the society to collapse under pressure. The Red Ball Express demonstrated it instead as a source of strength, successfully mobilizing every element of American society for the singular purpose of military victory. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein's final assessment, written from captivity in 1945 with time to reflect on all he had witnessed, captured the totality of the German officer corps' education in modern warfare. We prepared meticulously for every conceivable contingency except the reality of material abundance on this scale. We studied every aspect of warfare except industrial logistics as a decisive factor. We developed every weapon system imaginable except the one that mattered most in the end, which was the ability to sustain combat operations indefinitely through purely mechanical supply systems. The American Red Ball Express was not a military innovation in the traditional sense, but rather a civilian commercial practice, long-distance trucking, applied to military purposes with absolutely devastating effect on our ability to resist. The legacy of German officers' encounter with American logistics extended far beyond the immediate context of World War II. Their detailed testimonies influenced the development of NATO doctrine during the Cold War, shaped military planning for decades, and transformed modern military thinking about the fundamental relationship between logistics capabilities and combat operations. The phrase spoken by numerous German officers when observing American supply convoys in operation, that no army on earth can stop that, became a form of shorthand for describing the transformation of warfare from an art practiced by skilled professionals to an industrial process managed by organizational systems, from individual heroism celebrated in romantic tradition to systemic capability measured in tonnage delivered, From the management of scarcity that had characterized all previous military history to the projection of abundance on a scale that redefined what was possible. In the final analysis, the German officers who witnessed Patton's fuel convoys rolling relentlessly eastward across France were observing far more than military logistics in any traditional understanding of that term. They were witnessing the emergence of an entirely new form of national power, where industrial capacity properly organized, organizational efficiency systematically applied, and methodical planning executed with precision trumped all the traditional military virtues that professional soldiers trained in centuries of European military tradition held sacred and unquestionable. The Red Ball Express represented American society itself projected onto the battlefield, diverse in its composition, mechanized in its operations, abundant in its resources, and relentlessly efficient in its execution, all combining to produce results that professional soldiers could neither fully comprehend nor effectively counter with traditional methods. As General Colonel Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff throughout the war, signed the instrument of unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945, he reportedly told his aide in a moment of bitter honesty that they had not lost to a better army in the traditional sense, but rather to a superior system of organization and supply. That system, symbolized most dramatically by the endless convoys of the Red Ball Express rolling eastward day and night without pause, represented not just American military power in the narrow sense, but American industrial democracy in its entirety, not just logistics as a technical military function, but the fundamental logic of mass production principles applied with ruthless efficiency to the business of mass destruction. The German officers who watched those trucks rolling east in seemingly infinite numbers were witnessing the future of warfare itself, a future where ultimate victory would belong not to the nation with the best trained soldiers or the most tactically brilliant commanders, but to the nation with the greatest number of trucks and the most efficient systems for employing them, not to military genius in the Romantic tradition, but to industrial management executed with scientific precision, not to warrior spirit celebrated in song and story, but to systematic supply maintained regardless of circumstances. The Red Ball Express operated for only 83 days in total, but its impact on military thinking and doctrine lasted for decades afterward and continues to influence how modern militaries understand logistics. It demonstrated with absolute clarity that in modern industrial warfare, logistics was not just important as a supporting function, but completely decisive in determining outcomes, not just supportive of combat operations, but determinative of what combat operations were even possible. The German officers who observed it in action learned this lesson with devastating clarity as their forces collapsed. Their testimony stands today as both invaluable historical record and permanent military warning to future generations. In the age of mechanized warfare and industrial production, the nation that cannot sustain its forces in the field cannot possibly prevail in extended conflict, regardless of how much tactical skill its soldiers display or how brilliant its operational commanders may be. The trucks rolling east on the Red Ball Highway were not just carrying supplies forward to Patton's Third Army in the immediate tactical sense. They were carrying the future of warfare itself into reality, a future that left the Wehrmacht and its proud officer corps consigned permanently to history, defeated not by superior strategy in the classical sense, but by superior supply systems, not by better generals schooled in military theory, but by better logistics executed with industrial precision, not by military might in the traditional understanding, but by industrial abundance projected with ruthless efficiency onto the battlefields of Western Europe and maintained there regardless of distance or opposition until final victory was achieved.